Hi guys, I'm back for the final installment of our energy discussion. So remember, this is the content in chapter 13 from the textbook. And let me pull up my screen and then we can get started. Okay, so we've talked about energy throughout the semester so far, or throughout the last week so far. And can I start from the beginning here? Slideshow. Just let me start my slideshow. Okay, sorry. So basically we have different natural resources that we use to create energy. For the most part, these are fossil fuels, kind of old organic matter that was formed on the earth originally through photosynthesis over about 300 or 400 million years ago. That's buried in the ground. And there are a variety of different reasons why it is undesirable for us to be dependent on those types of natural resources for our energy source, which we've discussed. There's also nuclear energy. We can mine this kind of ore material, this kind of rock and metal material that contains radioactive isotopes, and use the energy that's released from the nucleus of these elements contained in that matter as it experiences radioactive decay. We talked about that. And so now we're ready to talk about renewable energy. So these are sources of energy which basically can't be used up. So we use the sunlight one day, but then the sun comes up tomorrow and there's more. Or the wind turns a turbine today, but that doesn't use up the wind. It's going to be back tomorrow. So that's kind of what defines a renewable source. And we looked at this graphic at the beginning of the lecture on fossil fuels. This is again from the federal government, Department of Energy, Energy Information Agency, Association, I forget what the A stands for, administration, I guess. And then 11% of our total energy picture in the United States comes from renewables at this point. We need to ramp this up significantly if we want to move away from fossil fuels at a rate that will improve our outcomes from global warming. And though that 11% is made up of 22% hydroelectric, some biomass, so that's a combination of like wood and other biofuels that might come from things like corn or sugarcane and other waste that's like maybe burning garbage kind of thing. Then wind, 24%, the next kind of biggest component, solar, and then geothermal. So we're going to kind of go through and talk about how these different sources work, and then we're going to think about some of the benefits and drawbacks of using these different types. And then before I do that, let me just say that probably moving towards a much bigger renewable energy portfolio does not mean embracing one of these technologies over others. It means embracing many of them all together, and certain elements of this renewable energy picture are going to be more successful in certain areas of the country depending on the climate situation there, the latitude situation there, just the other natural resources like presence of rivers or forests. But even in a particular area, probably the picture looks like a combination of many different renewables being used at once. Okay, so biomass together, those three different types of biomass create the biggest component of renewables. So we'll start there. And essentially, as we've learned throughout the semester, plants, primary producers, those organisms at the bottom of the food chain, have this capacity to capture inorganic energy that comes as radiation from the sun, as light energy, and then they can transform that energy into chemical potential energy that is stored in sugars in their body. So they do this through photosynthesis by taking carbon dioxide from the air, water that they absorb from the ground, and then the sunlight, and then transforming the energy into a potential energy form that can then later on be burned in either the cells of the plant or the cells of other organisms that eat the plant, or outside an organism. We can burn plants, we can burn logs in our fireplace, in our campfire, and they release a whole lot of energy. So in that case, we're kind of doing the opposite of photosynthesis. We're taking oxygen, we're combining it with sugar and heat, and then we're returning that chemical potential energy back to an inorganic form, a heat energy form, and then we're releasing carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so in this case, biomass is something that can be used up in the production of energy. So, you know, if we have a log, if we have a tree, we cut it down, we burn it, it's gone. But as long as we're harvesting these resources in a sustainable way, then we should be able to regrow another tree, for example, in the same place where the tree previously was. So in that way, it's considered renewable. Now, there are certainly places in the world where growing human population is causing a harvesting of biomass in environments that is essentially unsustainable. So they're harvesting biomass faster than it's growing back. And that's leading to kind of future concern over which energy sources might be available, and is also transforming ecosystems and landscapes in ways that's undesirable to those local communities. But it's possible for this to be done in a renewable way. And some of us still, even in the developed world, depend on wood. Like I have a wood stove that I use to heat my home. But this is a source that's particularly important in the developing world, where they may use wood as a source for heating, but they also use wood as a source for like heating or boiling and sanitizing water and other things like that, which we don't use a lot of wood for that in our country, although we do use some. Okay, so another form of biomass is not used to create heat or to cook with, but is used to try to form some sort of fuel that we can use in our cars, our buses, our trucks, as some sort of transportation fuel. And so you may have heard of like ethanol-based kind of gasoline, or gasoline that has a certain amount of ethanol in it, or biodiesel. So the usage of these kinds of fuels are on the rise. In the United States, for instance, 20% of all the corn that we grow goes into sort of biofuels production. Brazil also has kind of an impressive ethanol production that is driven by their sugar cane. They grow a lot of sugar in their climate. So 40% of their transportation comes from sugarcane, or transportation fuel comes from sugarcane. That's much, much more than the kind of biofuel that we have as part of our transportation picture in the United States. So this is a potential idea of how we could try to get away from gasoline. However, it takes a lot of plant matter to make gasoline. So there's probably not going to be an ability for us to do this on the scale that we would really need to replace all the petroleum and gasoline that we use in this day and age. So another con would be that as we burn these organic compounds, they are releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. So while they do have some benefits over fossil fuels, they probably, or they don't necessarily help us really improve our greenhouse gas picture. And then another problem is that it's somewhat energy inefficient to create these fuels in the first place. So once they're created, they have pretty good energy content, but a lot of energy and water goes into taking corn or sugarcane and turning it in to ethanol or biodiesel. And then kind of as I already said, probably we just really don't logistically have the capacity to grow enough plants to have enough kind of stored chemical potential energy in plant cells to fuel all the transportation needs that we have. So it's not necessarily kind of like the best use of our land area or our like water input or fertilizer input that would be required to make this happen. So one comparison that we mentioned earlier on in the class that I'll bring up again is that the sun's energy, as it shines down, can be turned into chemical potential energy via photosynthesis in like a cornfield, and that happens at a rate of about 0.5 to 3% energy efficiency. So those plants are capturing like less than 5% of the energy that's hitting the ground from the sun. Whereas if that same area was covered with a photovoltaic solar panel, it would have like probably more than 10% efficiency. So we could take that same land area, then we could take half or a third of that land area and cover it with solar panels and get the same output without any greenhouse gases. Now, we may have a desire to have plants covering large land areas rather than solar panels, but just as a comparison, it's worth considering. Okay, so then finally, like I said, we might prefer to have our land covered in different kinds of plants, even if they're kind of non-native fuels-based plants. And although burning these does release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, if we're growing back those plants in the same location the following year or the following cropping cycle, then theoretically we should be pulling that same carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. So in that way, some people consider these fuels to be what's called carbon neutral. They release a certain amount of carbon, but then we can capture that carbon back by keeping this cycle of growing going from year to year. Okay, also we have an industry, especially in our area, of forest biomass. And in this case, when we cut material down from the forest and try to transform it into energy, we're not transferring it into a biofuel, but instead we're using it to primarily create electricity or, of course, like heat in our homes. And so renewable green energy is kind of the term that's used to refer to this. So in this case, if biomass is utilized to produce renewable energy that can help us reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, we consider that to be renewable green energy. It doesn't mean that it doesn't create greenhouse gases, which burning wood certainly does, but it does get us away from this fossil fuel use. And then at the same time, this is considered to be a benefit in a lot of areas because we have an interest in going through and doing kind of what some people would call forest restoration, where we're trying to thin out a lot of trees that have grown in and made forests a lot more dense over the last 100 years, where we've had this kind of wildfire fighting policy that has caused us to put out fires more quickly than they would be put out in a natural environment. And so these fires haven't been kind of taking out small trees, and now we have a much denser forest than we had before. So this is creating problems by capturing water on the landscape, by making fires that do happen much more risky. So anyway, we have an interest in cutting down trees anyway. And so if we can then use these trees and capture the energy that they have to produce electricity in a controlled way, rather than waiting for them to burn up in a forest fire where they're going to release these greenhouse gases anyway, then that could be a benefit to us. So anyway, they do certainly release greenhouse gases, but over the long term, if we're going to grow back trees in this area, we might be able to consider these fuels carbon neutral on a longer scale picture. And also remember that there's this consideration of, well, we consider that these trees have a high likelihood of burning up anyway. Why wouldn't we try to control the burning in a way that gives us this energy resource at the same time? So we do this kind of thing a lot in Quincy. We have a biomass burner on the Feather River College campus that creates heat for the dorms. That's over kind of by the county health annex building. Also, we have a big, what's called a cogeneration plant in Quincy at the SPI mill. And what cogeneration means is that biomass plant that's on the mill site is using all the sawdust and other kind of forest waste products that are produced after it makes lumber, and they're burning those in a big area, and they're heating up water, they're creating steam that turns turbines, the same process we've talked about before with coal and nuclear, to produce electricity. But at the same time, they're also just generating heat, of course, from burning all that wood. And then they take that heat and they pipe it through venting to heat the plant, and then in particular to also heat the kilns that are used to dry the wood. So instead of just having all this excess heat that they're trying to get rid of and cool down, they're actually using that heat that they're generating at the same time, cogen, as they're creating electricity to do jobs on the plant. So this used to be kind of a common thing that electricity plants would do, but now a lot of these power plants are kind of far away from areas that would need to use this heat, and so there's not as much kind of double benefit from the heat that's created at the same time that the electricity is created. Often that heat is kind of considered an undesirable product that they're trying to get rid of, and they're using water and other things to work hard to cool down all this heat that's being produced at the power plant. So anyway, when you see that big smokestack coming up in Quincy, that's the cogen. And the cogen plant in Quincy, I shouldn't be quoting this, but I think it produces about 20 kilowatt hours. And I'm trying to imagine if that's a month or a year, but basically my understanding is that plant produces about enough energy to fuel somewhere between 10 and 20,000 homes. So that can be a lot of energy produced in this way. Okay, so kind of a final kind of biomass or organically produced fuel source would be methane. So we talked about methane before as a form of natural gas. And so natural gas is a type of fossil fuel that's created from really old organic matter that has broken down underground and kind of transformed into methane that's trapped underneath rock layers and soil layers. And we have to kind of break up that rock or put pipes into the rock to get that natural gas out of the ground. But also methane is produced all the time on the surface when organic matter is breaking down. When organisms fart, for instance, they're letting out methane, or when organic matter is breaking down, particularly in areas where it doesn't have perfect access to oxygen. So maybe like when it's like soggy or in water or buried, like in a landfill setting. And so areas like feedlots or sewage or landfills produce a lot of methane. And this methane, as it's just released to the atmosphere, is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 20 times more effective at trapping heat compared to CO2. And it just has a lot of energy that can potentially be combusted and taken advantage of. So if there's locations where we have a bunch of organic matter that's breaking down into methane in a concentrated area, if we can kind of design a system where we can capture and pipe this area, like from a sewage plant or from a landfill to a nearby power plant, we could use it to like produce electricity or, you know, as like just natural gas that would come into your home and be burnt, kind of like propane for like gas-based appliances. It doesn't always go into creating electricity, although it can. Then this is kind of a win-win where we're kind of capturing this greenhouse gas before it gets into the atmosphere. We're burning it to produce energy in a controlled space where we want the energy. And then the end product is still a greenhouse gas. When we burn methane, it turns into CO2, but CO2 now is 20 times less potent as a greenhouse gas than methane. So we'd rather be releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than methane if one of them has to enter the atmosphere. So anyway, there is certainly development in this area as well. Okay, so now that we've got that picture kind of slightly outlined in our mind, let's move to hydropower. So hydropower are areas where water is just moving as it flows downhill, like in a river system. And that water is used to turn turbines. So in most of the other cases, we have this natural resource that we're burning to release energy to turn water into steam, and the steam is turning turbines and then, you know, fueling generators, which are magnets, to create electrical charges. In the case of hydropower, it's the liquid water that's doing this job to turn the turbines. And hydropower is extensively used both in the US and worldwide. and it produces about 25% of the global energy, and primarily, almost exclusively, that's for electricity. A lot of the dams that are used are big, large-scale hydropower dams, things like the Hoover Dam that you might have seen in person or seen pictures of. In the US Southwest, the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest dam in the world, which is in China, or the Aswan Dam, which is on the Nile River in Egypt. These are all kind of massive scale projects that are used to produce a whole lot of electricity in those regions. Now, there are concerns with dams. We talked about this back in the water lecture, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this again. But as we mentioned at the time, of course, damming up rivers is not advantageous to species that have to be able to navigate up and down rivers to complete their life cycle, like salmon or steelhead, that have an interest in moving freely back and forth through rivers. So of course, we've seen a huge drop off in these different kinds of salmon and steelhead populations all up and down the West Coast. And then there's similar kind of drop offs in other fisheries in other parts of the world, not exclusively, but in large part due to the damming up of all the rivers that were their original habitats. Also holding a lot of water behind a dam, especially in a hot and arid area, will lead to a lot of evaporation off the surface. So we'll actually lose water from the system if we're holding it behind dams for long periods of time. And then another consideration is that this really disrupts nutrient cycling. So normally nutrients like fish poop and sediment and things like that are allowed to move from the upper reaches of a watershed and then are distributed down through the watershed and eventually flushed out to the mouth of the watershed and eventually to the ocean. But these big barriers kind of interrupt that process. And so we can build up lots of sediment behind dams in an undesirable way, but we can also kind of starve the downstream areas of the river from the nutrients that they would be getting in a more natural flow setting. So anyway, these are some of the concerns about hydropower, but it is a highly effective, efficient, and cheap way to produce electricity from a renewable resource. So we don't use the water up as we produce electricity from it. It's still there, and it doesn't produce greenhouse gases for the most part. There can be a little bit of change of off-gassing of greenhouse gases along river systems as we change the shape of the river and flood and then dry out areas. But for the most part, the net impact is not a lot of greenhouse gas emission. Okay, so then the other kind of really big electricity producer, so remember going back, I forget which one's which, I think maybe wind is now 24% of our renewable picture, and then hydropower is like 22% or vice versa, but they're both kind of over 20%. Wind is another big player, is my point, in the electricity production picture from renewables, and it's the fastest growing energy source. So hydropower used to be kind of a more dominant form of renewable energy production, and wind is catching up and surpassing that. One of the advantages of wind is that it's relatively cheap, which is also true of hydropower compared to other renewable source types like solar panels. And then another advantage of using wind turbines to create electricity is that we can usually use them in the same area where we have another land use going on. So unlike solar panels, they're not really like covering the ground necessarily, which is of course not true if you have a solar panel like on a roof that's already there. But if you're trying to build a big solar installation, you're kind of having a disruption to the ecosystem, whereas wind turbines are a lot of times put in places where we already have like agriculture going on underneath. And so this can be a benefit to like helping farms kind of make enough money to survive if they're able to get some money from their electricity production at the same time that they're farming underneath. So overall, the wind picture seems like a pretty promising one. I'm sure everybody who spent any time driving around California has seen these big wind turbines. This is also a big booming industry in places like West Texas, which has historically been thought of like an oil economy, but it is increasingly becoming a renewable energy economy as well. Unfortunately, there are some drawbacks, and those are usually associated with kind of birds and bats that come in contact with these turbines to an unhappy end. And of course, sometimes this could be insects as well, butterflies and whatnot. And sometimes they could be directly hit by the spinning turbines, but also just the changes in atmospheric pressure that happen around the turbines can be disruptive to their kind of anatomy and physiology in a way that's detrimental. So here's one study that came out. This is from a few years ago. I just happened to know somebody who was working on it, which is why it came to mind in this discussion. But this is looking at different species of bats, and then it's looking at what percentage of these species were not injured as they were living in the environment of turbines, as opposed to which, so that in an external way. And then it's also looking at different kinds of internal injuries. So internal hemorrhaging or internal bleeding. A huge percent of bats were experiencing that as they were flying around these turbines. And then pulmonary lesions, basically like cuts on the lungs that would have to do with these really weird pressure increases and drops that are going on as bats are flying around. So 100% of bats being negatively affected. So if we are thinking about biodiversity and ecosystem health, this is definitely a cost, right? Not necessarily like, can't exactly write up the monetary cost, but certainly like a societal environmental cost of depending on turbines. Okay, so moving on, solar is something that is increasingly being pushed, especially in places like California or the Southwest that are pretty sunny. And basically the idea is that the sun is this massive energy source. It produces energy through a process of nuclear fusion, which we're not going to get into, but it releases a lot of energy. That energy travels to Earth in the form of light energy, heat energy, ultraviolet energy, et cetera, et cetera. But if we can capture that energy and turn it into a form that we can use, whether that's like usually electricity or also just maybe heat that we're interested in having in particular spaces, then that's an advantage to us. And we know, or we have every expectation that the sun is not going to be going away anytime soon. So there's kind of two main types of solar energy capture technology. So the first one is called kind of a solar like thermal collector, and these can be passive or active. And we'll talk about how those work in a second. And then there's photovoltaic cells, which is probably what you would think of or have seen before if you've seen like solar panels on the roof of some like building, or yeah, usually like a building. So go back to the first one, these solar collectors or soil thermal collectors. The idea is that the energy is shining down, or the energy from the sun is shining down on some sort of either fluid or solid material that is going to be able to kind of conduct heat. So in this case, they're trying to capture the heat energy that's coming from the sun. And so this might be, again, a fluid, in which case it's called active solar collectors, or it might be some sort of like metal or other material, in which case it's called passive solar collectors. And some people have these like on their roofs as well, and they would have like water that would be like up on their roof in some sort of it's like solar panel thermal collector contraption, and the water would be heated by contact with the sun, and then it would flow down and circulate like into a water tank or into their shower, into their sink, so that they can use the heat that comes directly from the sun rather than having to burn coal or use hydropower to create electricity, or propane to heat water that then they can have hot when they want it. So that's where it's used in kind of a small scale, localized area, but also a lot of the big solar panel plants that have gone in are these kind of large scale concentrated solar power projects. And in this case, they use big mirrors to focus all the sun that's flowing into an area, usually onto an active collector, so like a tube of fluid that's getting really hot and then is moving off site. And then they're using that heat energy to like either turn turbines, usually to create electricity. That's usually the process, but they could use it for heating or other things like that as well. So that's all a little bit different than the photovoltaic cell model, which again is kind of like the classic solar panel. And in this case, what happens is the sun hits the material that the solar panel is made of, which is primarily silicon, and just kind of the inherent energetics and physics of that compound that it's hitting creates an electrical current as the solar energy hits the material. So there's this direct conversion from the energy of the sun to electricity without having to go through the whole like creating steam, creating water, turning a turbine, turning magnets to create electricity. It's kind of a more instantaneous electrical production process. However, the material that's required to make the solar panels is still relatively expensive compared to other energy sources. And so this is one reason that solar panels have been a little bit slower to roll out than people might like, although the prices are coming down. Okay, so particularly large-scale solar power plants are a bit controversial. On the bottom left is a picture of a massive solar plant that went in 2014 in Mojave, so southeastern California. That's called Ivanpah. It's the largest solar concentrating energy plant in the world, and it produces enough energy for 140,000 homes. So that's a lot. And there, of course, was controversy about the environmental, like local and regional environmental impact of putting this into what is considered by some to be a sensitive habitat. So in particular, this habitat is populated by endangered desert tortoises. And after a series of lawsuits, the company ended up coming into an agreement to remove all the tortoises that they found in the area to another habitat at what ended up being a considerable cost, about $55,000 per tortoise. This was quite astounding to lots of people. And so of course that's a negative impact to this particular species. But then of course a lot of other species, again, like birds that are flying around in these areas, can essentially get overheated, in some cases burned or killed by the contact with the solar panel. So it's a trade-off that we have to consider if we want to depend on these large-scale solar panel systems to be able to produce our electricity. However, another option that, in my opinion, is a much better option is to, instead of trying to have large-scale solar panel power plants, to try to do this in a more localized and diffused rollout, where we encourage people through subsidies or hopefully just like dropping prices of solar panels over time as the material is becoming cheaper, technology is improving, and just more people are buying things, right? Which usually causes the price of things to go down. So here would be an example of like a solar neighborhood that exists in Sacramento. We have one of these in Quincy over by the mill on Lee Road that you might have seen. And so in this case, we're putting a solar panel in an area that is already disturbed. We already have a house and we already have a roof in this area. So that roof is not supporting a thriving ecosystem. And so why not put the solar panel there? And then we're also, in this case, not going to be losing energy as we're trying to transmit energy over long distances, which is kind of not a very efficient way to use energy that you've produced. So anyway, I think this is more of a sustainable looking energy picture than this. Okay, so that kind of brings me to storage solutions. So one of the problems that we have with our energy picture so far is that we actually produce a lot more energy than we need, but we lose a lot of the energy that we produce because it's hard for us to predict perfectly where and when we should be producing energy and how much we're going to need, and then we can't store it very well as we would like. And then also, if we're trying to move energy over long distances, we are losing a lot of energy to the environment, right? We learned about the second law of thermodynamics earlier, saying we can't kind of concentrate energy in a perfectly organized way for long. It's eventually going to be dissipated and spread out to be more evenly distributed in the environment. And so we're losing energy from our transmission lines or from other ways of moving energy around. And so we want to make investments in kind of having a more localized energy grid and improving other electricity storage devices, like investing in better battery technology. And then there's also other kinds of technology that we don't really have the time to get into, things like fuel cell technology that we might see increasing more in the future. But this is just like a little model of kind of an electrical car system, and you can see all the different components, and then the charger and the battery system. And so anyway, this is the kind of investment that we want to make so that we are not having as much negative environmental impact and cost associated with creating energy, because we don't actually have to produce as much energy in the first place because we're using it more efficiently. We're all going to be better off. So this would also cause like investments in a better energy grid. So like trying to reduce transmission distances, as I've already mentioned, but then also probably putting different kinds of sensors within our line so we can see where and when energy is actually being used, and where and when it might be available, and then also allowing us to have the ability to send energy back when it's not being used. So right now our grid is usually like a linear, like a one-way grid, where energy moves from a power plant into our home, and then if we don't use it, it's just kind of like used up or lost. But a smart grid system could then maybe potentially take energy like back out from localized like power lines and kind of move them back the other direction and pass them to where they're needed and when they're needed. And again, this would allow us to just use less energy overall, so we would have fewer environmental impacts in this way. Okay, so one of the final points I want to make is that a lot of people have commented that, yeah, renewables are nice, but they've questioned, like, are they really capable of completing or making enough energy that we really need? Currently, they're only making up for 11% of the energy picture in our country. But other countries have made bigger investments and been able to see renewables doing a lot more work for them. So for example, as of 2017, Germany was producing 85% of its electricity on average from renewable energy. And that was a combination of things like wind, solar, biomass, hydro. And as a country, they were also making a commitment to get off nuclear. They decided some of the risks associated with nuclear were not worth the benefits. And so they're moving in this direction. And I do want to point out, though, that 85% of the electricity is a great start. It's more than a great start. It's way farther than we are, but this is not combating the other main issue that we have, which is creating a renewable form of transportation fuel. So right now, a lot of our energy is used in transportation, which is primarily not fueled by electricity. So what are we going to do about transportation? It's a big energy hog. Well, first of all, we can make better investments in a society in public transportation and rail and high-speed rail, things like that. They're a lot more efficient than cars. then we can try to drastically improve our fuel efficiency of the cars that we already have. Unfortunately, this is a little bit political. Like California has historically had a higher fuel efficiency that it legally requires to be able to sell and register cars in California, and the federal government is suing California, trying to say that they can't get out ahead of the rest of the country. So that's going on. Stay posted. But urban and suburban, better urban and suburban planning, things like improving bike lanes, improving public transportation, reducing distances between where people live and where businesses and shopping centers are, is a way that we can reduce the amount of car-based transportation that we're involved in. And then, of course, trying to transition our fleet of cars from fuel-based cars to electrical-based cars could give us a lot more flexibility in how we're creating the energy that we need for the electricity to drive the cars, right? So we can make electricity from wind, from water, from the sun, from nuclear, also from things like coal and natural gas. Whereas right now, gasoline is really almost exclusively made from petroleum, with a few biofuel alternatives that we discussed the pros and cons of before. So that's probably a direction that we're gonna see our country and world moving in. On the flip side, there are some concerns about the environmental impacts of the batteries that are used in electrical cars. So mining the materials that's required to make the batteries, and then also like disposing of the batteries in a safe way is something that we need to do a better job doing in a safe way, because they can be toxic. And then I already kind of mentioned the trade-offs around biofuels, but that is a potential part of our transition to our transportation future as well. Okay, so just a couple more slides here. One, comparing costs of different fuels. This is from 2017. The red vertical lines that are cutting across the different color bars are showing the global average cost measured in US dollars of producing 1 kilowatt hour of energy. And then we have these different horizontal bars that represent the range of costs that we see of different energy producing types. So there's this kind of like gray area between about 5 cents and about let's see, what would that be, like 16 or 17 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the range of costs from fossil fuels, so coal being on the cheaper end of that. And then you can see how these renewables stack up. So certain renewables, like solar in particular, tend to be on the more expensive end, but some, excuse me, are on the cheaper end, with both hydropower and kind of onshore wind turbines and some biomass options being kind of certainly within, but also on the lower end, and in some cases even below the cost of producing energy through fossil fuels. So that's a promising thing to see. And then one thing on here, geothermal, I somehow skipped the slide. I guess I had it accidentally hidden about geothermal earlier, but let me just quickly mention that geothermal energy is energy that is produced just because of the naturally existing heat that's in the rock that's below ground. So if we continue to dig down from the Earth's surface, eventually it just gets hotter and hotter. This is particularly true when we have areas where magma is coming up underneath the ground. So if we have kind of like a volcanically active area, we'll have a lot more magma rising up and bringing extra heat. And that heat can be captured if we pipe like fluids underground. They can be heated down there and then we can move them back up to the surface. Or in some cases, the magma is just naturally heating like groundwater that then can be kind of tapped into, and then we can move that hot material up and we can kind of capture energy in that way. Our campus at Feather River takes advantage of some sort of geothermal heat loops. So a lot of our buildings are cooled and heated through geothermal loops. And the idea here is that we pipe fluid, I'm pretty sure it's water, it might be air in some cases, or some other fluid, down into the ground. And as we go down to not a really deep depth, but like I'm not quite sure how deep they are, maybe like 10 feet below the ground or something. In the summertime, if we don't dig too deep, it's actually a little bit cooler underground than it is on the surface. So the fluids actually cool down underground and they can come up and cool buildings. And in the summertime, or sorry, in the wintertime, when it's really hot up or cold on the surface, if we pipe these fluids underneath the ground, it's actually going to be warmer underneath the ground compared to the air temperature. So then we can pipe these warmer fluids into the buildings and heat the buildings that way. So anyway, that's geothermal is another kind of way that we can primarily heat and cool things. I'm not aware of a lot of electricity production that is done through geothermal, but I'm sure there are places where that happens. So that's just one that we accidentally skipped over. Okay, finally, comparing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is another like cost, right? Not necessarily a direct monetary cost, although it does have direct monetary costs in the long run, but a cost of using different fuel types. So you can see the amount of CO2 that's released per kilowatt hour, not just in burning the fuel, but in like mining, in refining and manufacturing and transporting the fuel. So that's what it means by the life cycle of this. And we can see the fossil fuels are over on the right. So coal, oil, and natural gas have like their median energy production. So that's like the middle of the range of energy productions that are significantly higher, like in some cases like 1,000 times higher in the case of coal compared to some of our renewables. And then on the other end of the graph, things like biomass have a little bit of a higher CO2 output when we're looking at their life cycle. Photovoltaics are slightly higher too because of all the manufacturing that's required to make the photovoltaic cells. But for the most part, these renewable energy sources are having thousands or hundreds of times less greenhouse gas output resulting from energy that's produced in this way. So we've talked extensively in this class so far about our desire to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this is like very, very clear evidence that moving towards these renewables, which if we go back one slide, is also not necessarily a lot more costly than using fossil fuels as we improve technology and improve options here, is going to be a really good way to improve our kind of climate future. Okay, so kind of to sum up, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, as I've emphasized all along, all of these energy sources have some drawbacks associated with them. And so just, transitioning to exclusively renewables is not all of what we want to do. We want to also just transform our systems in a way that we're using overall less energy. And some of that is going to be technology based, some of that's going to be behavior based. We are headed in the right direction. That's the good news. So this is a graph we looked at originally in the fossil fuels video showing per capita, right, per person energy consumption in the United States. And we can see that it was going up and up and up for about 100 years. But in the last couple decades, we've actually seen a per capita drop in energy consumption that's primarily associated with improved technology. So we are headed in the right direction, but unfortunately, probably not quickly enough. So we need to make this, in my opinion, a huge investment in our future and in our country and in our world. So hopefully that's something that we will support. All right, that's a wrap.